Well, welcome, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to introduce Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi tonight to launch our Wednesday night lecture series. This semester, we embrace the notion of a body of work, buildings, whether architecture, landscape, or infrastructure, through which architects work out their larger engagement with the world in very tangible and meaningful ways. For Weiss Manfredi, it is of course neither architecture, nor landscape, nor infrastructure, but always the simultaneous intertwining, layering, and hybridizing of all three that is at work in the creation of new forms of public natures, a notion which brings together, as Barry Bergdoll notes in his foreword to their upcoming third monograph, Public Natures, Evolutionary Infrastructures, two worlds in the process of extinction. In the face of such disappearance, the firm's thinking and projects take on their full dimension, demonstrating how, after more than a decade of careful, relentless, and inspiring work, both public and nature can be reinvented, reproduced, and recast in rich, multiple, and always surprising ways, making Weiss Manfredi's body of work radically important for today's architectural, urban, and ecological practices. For whether it is through their most recognizably architectural work, the Diana Center at Barnard College, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center, and the recently completed Krishna Singh Center for Nanotechnology at the University of Pennsylvania, or through their seminal infrastructural landscapes, such as the groundbreaking Seattle Art Museum Olympic Sculpture Park, the Hunter Point South Waterfront Park in Queens, or the Yongsan National Urban Park Master Plan in Korea, Weiss Manfredi engage in similar and complex operations which stitch micro and macro scales, provoke sectional opportunities, and invite hybrid programs to produce continuous topographies that move seamlessly from inside to outside, from city to garden, ground to roof, private to public, individual to collective, in large swath of gradient-like transitions from one to the other. In Weiss Manfredi's work is a stubborn and inspiring optimism that architecture can and should still make a difference, whether it is constructing new social infrastructures through the synthetic convergence of landscape, architecture, engineering, and urbanism at work in undermining the rigidity of disciplinary boundaries in university and research settings, or whether it is claiming how architecture, understood as Can Frampton's megaform, can still impact the urban context and create a landmark that is not an icon but a quilt, i.e. not a reductive sign, but a thick multidimensional ground that fundamentally recasts our relationship with the environment. In Public Natures, Evolutionary Infrastructures is a great conversation between Marion, Michael, Justin Fowler, and Can Frampton, in which Can powerfully notes that architecture touches reality like no other profession. The work of Weiss Manfredi's work is not only deeply embedded within the real, it produces a new reality, at once material and poetic, with a unique combination of ease, skill, gracefulness, and urgency. And with every project, book, or building, their unconditional commitment to a systematic ecological agenda opens up that much further the much-needed possibilities for our collective practices today. I'm also very pleased to welcome tonight's respondent, Justin Davidson, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, classical music and architecture critic at New York Magazine, and author of the forthcoming book Magnetic City, to be published by Random House. Justin has written some of the most sizzling articles and reviews in recent years. Amongst my favorite are Because Fulton Center is the Best Thing to Happen to Commuting Since the Swipe Card, Is Gentrification All Bad, Unfashionably Fashionable, Mr. and Mrs. Architect, Can the Suburb Be Saved, and An Out-of-Tune Piano, to name just a few. Justin will join us after the lecture, but for now, please welcome Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi.
Thank you, Amale. What a generous introduction, and Michael and I are so thrilled to be able to be here tonight, to be part of this series and to be able to launch it. One of the great pleasures of being here at Columbia is that this is a school whose experimental approach to architecture and planning has continually questioned the impact of how we build, where we build, why we build, what we build, and what does this mean to impact our increasingly complex and fragile world. Our work has been greatly inspired by the question of what it means to shape a broader public terrain. And we've had the conviction that art, nature, design, ecology, architecture, and infrastructure somehow must be bound together in reciprocity. And we've been inclined towards projects, or each project, to reassess the limits of what has been stated for either the site or the program. And we actually have found ourselves drawn to projects that are not asking us to sort of build the perfect architectural object on an unobstructed site, but somehow to maybe shape and construct a site at the interstices of things that have never been viewed as a site for architecture. So the sites and programs we've inevitably found most compelling are those that avoid neat disciplinary distinctions or any kind of clearly delineated edge.
So this evening, we'll share a set of preoccupations through 10 projects. So we hope you're patient. They're evolving experiments. I think emphasize the word experiments in the creation of a more elastic definition of design. And I should state that we're not alone in this kind of experiment. I think there's a sort of generational interest in expanding the role of design. Design that connects the loose ends of architecture, ecology, and infrastructure to create a new forum for public nature, hence the title of this evening's talk. This increasingly fluid and dynamic zone between these territories have been both the site and the inspiration for the trajectory of our work since we initiated our practice. I should state categorically and emphatically that it's very important to note that these projects also reflect the collective talents and the commitments of members of our studio who always provoke us, often uncomfortably. They always propel us forward. And we're also deeply grateful to them and to our collaborators, clients, and engineers whose work you'll see reflected this evening for their willingness to imagine a more elastic, open-ended interpretation of each project's boundaries. So emphatically, these projects are very much the kind of collective voice of a very large group of people who interact in very complex and dynamic ways over a very long period of time.
So the first image is not our project, but it's a project I like to think that we're all part of somehow. And in this era of global responsibility, we're reminded that architecture truly is a kind of social art, and that as the public realm and the natural world are both equally eroded over time, somehow we need to operate within this hybrid terrain and not just add the novel and new, but somehow transform sites at every scale and recast that which serves the individual and the collective in ways that question what's natural and what's public. And perhaps the most common ground of the 10 projects we'll share this evening is the uncommon intersection of the section and the capacity of the section to do more work. And the topographic preoccupation that we've had about the section's capacity to work has led to our own inclination to take a direct cut and section through the disciplines of architecture, landscape, and engineering, and art. And it's this expansive lateral and unlimited terrain that ultimately is the most intriguing. Now, again, not our project, but this ancient 1/3 of a mile long topographic cut, the Nazca lines in Peru, is very interesting because when you think about it, it's the inclination to make a mark on the land for something larger, in this case an astrological marking, or so it's thought to be. And so how do we mark something that's infrastructural in scale, or in the case of yet another project here, take these lines or forces or contours of a topography to somehow create intersections and social agendas that actually mark a contour of a kind of public life. So if we can think of the thickness of the section as something that could catalyze a public life, then we think about architects who've come before us, like Corbusier, who have said, well, what if that thickness can actually accommodate speed and slowness, intimacy and movement all at once? And Corbusier's dream of the systemic simultaneities is really very, very compelling. And in our own backyard, because we live just a block and a half from the Brooklyn Heights Promenade, what is really amazing is this moment where a 70-foot grade change accommodated this terrifying need to get the BQE out of Brooklyn Heights over to the edge with the stacked north and southbound lanes of traffic and an elevated public realm. And what that does, which is so interesting, is it sets up an amazing model when we think about resilience and waterfront and urban life all at the edge.
Maybe we can you hear me? Oh, we can. Well, we're perpetually provoked by the power of natural and unnatural forces, controlled and uncontrolled mobilities. So today, in the face of so many, even just a few days ago, or if you're up in Boston, so many simultaneous challenges, perhaps the challenge, the charge for design is less a consolidating ideal, but rather a more instrumental project with thickness and depth that intensifies social, cultural, and natural reciprocities. So the unintended vulnerabilities that we experience as our own infrastructure failed with Hurricane Sandy, as captured by this compelling photograph by Iwan Bond, can in fact be reconceived with the temporary resilience of art, where entropy, so vividly expressed and absent from most architectural discussions, is expressed with Smithson's fantastic spiral jetty, which can be embraced and leveraged as an architectural project. But these simultaneous potentials raise deeper questions about interior and social landscapes. Is there a possibility for a more topographically and sexually active project, where movement perhaps up, through, over, and around offers a possibility for a more continuous territory for design? Yet each challenge is highly specific, and we've been trying to understand these possibilities, the possibility of creating a new public nature, one project at a time. So we'll start with the first project, which is the Museum of the Earth, which was actually done, it was designed in about 2000 and completed in 2003. So it has, I think, a sense of ancient history for us, perhaps legacy. And it is situated in a remarkable landscape of the Finger Lakes, right in Ithaca, near Lake Cayuga. And you can see the kind of graining of the Finger Lakes, which mark the receding of the last ice age. So it is kind of a very, very geologically rich and spatially intense landscape. So the site is this little red rectangle, and it too, the site, very much marks the presence of water. Water has shaped this landscape for well over 1 million years, many, many million years. This actually used to be an ocean. But you can see the kind of fissures, the kind of marks on the land that are very, very evident in the gorges around Ithaca. So with the passage of time, you get these incredibly architectural sequences across the terrain and down into Lake Cayuga. So this was an opportunity for us to design a small museum, about 20,000 square feet, a natural history museum where, according to the director, Warren Allman, charismatic paleontologist, the kind of disciplines of geology and biology would come together so you could have a more synthetic idea of how the Earth evolved. And what we, I think, happened into somewhat by accident was the sense that there was a possibility of designing more than a museum, to in fact embrace the design of the site, to think of the structure of the site as having a kind of pedagogical, an artistic, and a kind of spatial consequence. So you can start to see how the requirement for parking tended to organize the site according to a kind of linear spine that actually is the place where water tends to emerge and work its way down into Lake Cayuga. It also gave us an opportunity to, what was radical at the time, now much more common, to daylight the collection of water, to allow the water to become part of the narrative of the museum. So you can start to see, we like to think, that the museum actually starts when you get out of a car behind one of these berms and start to understand the shape of the land, the shape of the topography. And that, in turn, descends in a series of maneuvers or spatial events in a way that allow you to understand the sense of topography and hopefully also the passage of time. So you enter at an upper level. It's a kind of Guggenheim in reverse. So you enter high and then descend low to the museum levels. And it was also a sort of sense of trying to escape the black box of many natural history museums, in a sense, and this was, I think, driven also by our client's dream, to understand that the shape of the Earth today was driven by forces many, many millions of years ago. It's an obvious lesson, but it gave us a chance to think about this incredible collection, which you see depicted in these collages that Mary and I have done, to think of this collection as being living. It's not just the trace of something that occurred that is no longer relevant, but it's actually relevant and visible in many of the rocks that you see positioned around the museum. It's visible in the way the topography works, both at the macro and the micro scale. And you can start to see as we back up from the building itself, there's a kind of sense that the site unfolds. So it either recedes from you or advances. And behind each of these berms, we can collect water in a series of bioswales that are vegetated with ecosedium. Horsetail, which is a very, very ancient plant material that actually sucks up the toxins that would be found in the runoff, particularly from carbon fuels. That, in turn, is collected in a series of water terraces that are then diverted. So we had this incredible narrative. Of course, the museum opened, and it was the driest year in Ithaca, so there was no water. But fortunately, we now have plenty of it, so we're no longer embarrassed. But the museum itself is a kind of, it's been broken into two kind of pavilions that nest into the earth and allow you to kind of understand the topography of the site. They kind of mark the land, in addition to providing some very, very real thermal environments and help in this particularly tough climate to kind of make for a much more continuous and sophisticated envelope. At times, the building is overtly architectural, and at times it tends to disappear. But you come in, and on your right, you can see the right whale, which is a contemporary mammal, and you can see right away this kind of incredibly beautiful skeletal structure. And as you descend, you pass an art piece by the artist Barbara Page, 543 panels, each representing 1 million years. So there's a sense, as you descend, of the magnitude of geologic time. And then that kind of dark black rock is a Devonian rock, a couple 100 million years old. And in that rock, you can see a series of skeletal fossils that, in a way, remind us that this is a journey that's very, very relevant. So you can start to see the kind of water line of the plaza, so you can understand the passage of time spatially. And that water then is collected between these two buildings, discharged in a series of descending terraces, a series of water gardens, if you will. Collected, the concrete in a way serves as a sort of armature, and then finally it descends into a water detention area where it's relatively clean and can be discharged into Lake Cayuga. And this was a radical proposition at the time. What's interesting now, coming back some 10 years later, you can start to appreciate the resilience, almost fierce resilience that nature can provide, and this is a very, very active, thriving ecosystem. Moving to a very different kind of environment, but I think an environment that shares many of the same sublime beauties of the Finger Lakes is the Taekwondo Park Master Plan. And it's sited in a particularly beautiful part of Korea, Muju, where the topography is incredibly intense. This is in the south, also a region known for its ginseng. And as many of you know, Taekwondo isn't just a kind of a bunch of guys or girls kind of in a kind of martial arts pursuit, but is a way of thinking, a way of living, and is deeply embedded in very beautiful ways in Korean culture. So we took the kind of almost the choreography of Taekwondo as a point of departure and thought of, in a way, juxtaposing that against the choreography, the very overt choreography, the topography of this beautiful region. Now, the competition, like many competitions, called for taking this incredible fragile environment that you see on your left and identifying about 6 or 7 what they wanted were iconic buildings nested right in the middle of this valley. And the more iconic, of course, the more interesting, so on and so forth. I think you all know the kind of cliches that often crop up. What we were interested in was we're happy to do iconic buildings, but rather than an iconic building, to somehow come back to what we saw as this incredibly beautiful way of cultivating the land, an incredibly beautiful tradition of building architecture into the topography of the land. So we took essentially the program and pushed it to the edges of the valley so we could leave the valley free. And that valley, almost a kind of kilometer, allows us to develop a series of program elements, I guess almost like a pearls on a necklace, that start to define this large, relatively complex master plan into a series of precincts. Those precincts, in turn, are animated by a series of bridges that cross the topography and allow you to wander up about probably close to a 30-meter incline, so very significant. And then, of course, the presence of water, which was there, is there, will always be there, was for us probably in a way a kind of programmatic source material and an opportunity to think about how water behaves as it descends both naturally and with the kind of artifice of our own kind of hand, and how the water interacts with the landscape. The topography, the typology of the landscape was also something that was not mentioned in the program brief, but we thought extremely important to this region of Korea and, in fact, to the culture of Korea. So you can start to see kind of the deployment of elements on the site, to kind of three sort of constellations of elements. And the first,
of course, is the arena, with 70,000 people who practice actively Taekwondo. When they were moving the Federation down to this location, the arena was the most special place. And so we took the inspiration from the Celadon, which is so remarkable in terms of the treasures from Korea, and came up with a luminous ideal for that arena. But then the body, if you will, which is celebrated near the road and in the arena, has a complement with the school. And so this is the life of the mind. And so it hugs the topographic detours of the cross valleys. And in there, it's not the series of buildings that they'd expressed for the school itself, but really a continuity of an inhabitable topography that hosts the parade ground, that hosts the library, which you see cantilevered over there, and also hosts some of the more important things, because in Muju, skiing is one of the most remarkable things that's done there, and this site can actually host those adventures as well. And bathing and training also within the school and within the waters were seen as interlocked with each other. But what became very interesting is that it's body, mind, and spirit that are seen together in the practice of Taekwondo, and we thought it'd be really remarkable at the very top of the hill to actually have the site for the healing grounds through these series of water tables and water terraces, and those themselves are crossed by the most delicate of bridges that reach the very, very top. If you see that tower at the top, that was the first thing that was built on the site, and that is the destination, if you will, to overlook the valley. But our real goal was to reach a point that when you were near the top of that threshold, that you didn't see architecture any longer, but all you saw was the incredible magnificence of this setting. And so there you can see it's underway, under construction. There's funny things that happen when you do master plans and they get interpreted. Celadon seems like it was not going to make it, but the idea of that delicate topography making its way all the way to the top is one that's really well underway. But the idea of actually creating topographies and settings for a public that come to visit becomes altogether different when you think about a landscape like ours in Washington with the National Mall. This international competition that we entered with Olin to actually shape the new SYLVAN Theater on the National Mall was extraordinary, because in 1917, a woman named Alice Park Barney said, "Why don't we have a public theater on the mall?" And she got her way and got this little piece 400 feet from the Washington Monument to actually have outdoor performances. And over the years, and it's the most democratic of stages, it's withered in its capacity to inspire. And now you could say it's a strange little plywood appendage, if you will, to the perimeter of the mall. And it's directly, anybody looking at the stage is also simultaneously looking at all the tour buses that arrive and park to drop people off to tour the monuments on the mall. And so we thought that this was really a shame when we thought about how amazing the setting was, because it was also inches, if you could discount the traffic, inches from the tidal basin. So the the mall as one formal landscape, the tidal basin as another, so close yet so far in the location of a theater. So if we look at what we're looking at now, looking away from the monument, we thought, what would happen if you could be in a theater and actually look at the monuments in front of us, and performances could be hosted in front, and that we could just lift the land and shape a topography that would take all these elements, one after another, and introduce them as one because of another. And so you can see that this topography is actually creating a new center stage, three-sided. And in the lifting of that theater to look back towards the monument and the stage, we're also simultaneously concealing the buses. And in the shaping of this kind of topography, we could actually also create a new topography to extend to SYLVAN canopy and actually allow 3 different scales of performance to occur around here, from 100 people, 1,000 people, to 10,000 people altogether. And ultimately then, with the kind of slight benefit of that lifted topography, be able to peel off that top contour and cross all the traffic to make it to the tidal basin. And so really that move is really a kind of series of continuities that take these sorts of sites and conceal them with a new landscape, and take a historic gateway as you're arriving from the metro and actually lift the land in deference to the monument itself, and actually take that SYLVAN pavilion as part of this lifted topography to create then a kind of canopy that could be a winter canopy as well, and one where potentially then, and we hope in 2016 or 2017, there will be funding to allow this vision to be deployed. Now, we've been able to explore this question of chameleon topographies more recently here in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden Visitor Center, where the question was, how could you actually take this strange piece of the city and this extraordinary 52-acre garden and actually do something better than allowing people to go through a little turnstile? The kinds of lines from the parking lot were less than inspiring. And so we started to think, well, there's nothing wrong with the city, and there's nothing wrong with the garden being thought of as one and the same thing, if we could think of it almost like as a Mobius strip, where the edge of the city, the edge of the garden, could take us from 440 linear feet across and moving to the west to be able to enter the center of the garden. So that simple query to take this seduction from the city into the garden was one where, like the Museum of the Earth, it would go from being barely there to very present, a series of chameleon sections that could be literally created in this mass customization of the steel frame, which would guide you through a kind of trellis-like set of shadows. And those geometries would not only follow the original Olmsted path, but actually trace the drip line of trees so that none of the foundations would impact anything growing in the garden, and that your choice between city and garden would be that kind of precipice of the Flatiron at the gift store, of course. But that the gallery itself within the visitor center would be a place where you could also see people crossing at upper levels and through, be inspired to go into the garden, and potentially even host events in this, what we now describe as the largest two-sided room in New York that we know of. One where the ginkgo tree that we took down was responsible for the recladding of the room inside.
So you can start to see that room. It functions for multiple activities, from musical performances to symposia to weddings and events like that. But I think what's interesting that we want to call your attention to in this slide is the sort of sectional nature, not only of this room, but of the project. It's actually, the project is entered by from a series of different edges, and the series of paths kind of work their way through, around, over, and down. So you can start to see the upper path, which registers at the top of the kind of water line of this particular room. And that path actually descends from the Eastern Parkway entry to the garden. And Marion talked about the garden. There's a sort of element of seduction to a botanic garden where the path through and around are always such that they're never axial. There's always a sort of element of surprise. So the element of surprise is you descend, you slide across and look into that room at times. So the sort of room has a sense of porosity. You slide through the building, and then reemerge in a kind of balcony to look at another set of settings in the garden, and then finally descend to that room again. So you tend to see the room through a couple of different contexts. And this route is always exterior, so you're looking into the pavilion, just as in the pavilion you can look up and see this route. Then, of course, the amazing thing is that working with a botanic garden like the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, which is an amazing, just 54 acres, and it's actually one of the most incredible gardens in the world, it was a chance to really think very deeply about a green roof, which in some ways have become almost cliches. So the sense was that this roof wasn't just an aesthetic device or a way of appeasing a kind of larger public, but it really is hardworking. It absorbs gallons and hundreds of gallons, actually, seasonally. That water is diverted in a series of rain gardens that also capture water at grade. Then it's diverted into the Japanese pond, and then finally it is captured in a series of basins south of this particular site in the garden. So it's a way of collecting water, cleansing it, and it's a way of also experimenting with different kinds of grasses, different kinds of equisetum. There are 44,000 different grasses and plants that have been planted. So this is, in a way, the fifth facade becomes a kind of curated facade that the garden can use and continually experiment with. So here you start to see it about maybe a year after it was first planted. It has a different character. The grasses are very, very kind of ochre-colored in the winter and very beautiful against the snow. And then in the fall and the autumn, they become very, very grassy, and the sort of sense of the kind of kinetic quality as the wind blows this sort of roof around is really quite beautiful in ways that we had not anticipated. And then finally, you can start to see it in the spring. This is actually an earlier photo. But architecture is about inhabitation. It's about accommodating different constituencies. No one ever thought that ducks would find this roof hospitable. They're really cute, right?
It's affecting our waterproofing membrane.
These guys have a little studio in Brooklyn. They're very happy. But at times the building whispers, it disappears. Our hope sometimes is you don't even see the building. And at times it's overtly architectural as it announces itself, presents itself on Washington Street in Brooklyn, which many of you know is a very active street. And then finally, it is a chameleon. It embraces the seasonal change, the sense that this building, hopefully, will always be slightly different upon each visit. So a very different opportunity for us to think about architecture, to think about landscape, is a project that we're doing with Arup and TBA, currently very much a work in progress. The first phase is just completed on Hunters Point Park, which many of you know has this incredibly idyllic prospect to Manhattan. And it is, in a way, a kind of everyone's fantasy of a linear park. It captures from the Queensboro Bridge to the UN to the Chrysler, the Empire. It has this sort of Fellini-esque quality where it's almost surreal in its positioning. But it's also had this incredibly rich history, a history that's certainly evident in the kind of pre-colonial era, or as recently as 1780, as a series of very, very fertile wetland ecologies. And then it became a real industrial engine when New York at the turn of the century was an industrial powerhouse, and then fell into a little bit of disrepair. But you can start to see how the site behaved, and we'll talk a little bit about this, during Hurricane Sandy when the project had just opened, when the first phase had just opened. So here's the design, early designs for the park. And what we were particularly interested in, and this, again, we weren't alone, but this was a rather radical idea, which was to provide a fairly significant amount of linear, soft edges that could absorb water. And these two images we were actually allowed, or not allowed to show, we were allowed to share only discreetly, because pre-Sandy these were considered provocative and considered, well, something that might happen 100 years from now. But the idea of the park is that it could, like a giant sponge, change its spatial configuration and absorb water and actually be a pleasant place to be. while partially submerged. So the backbone of the park is a series of corridors. There's an interpretive corridor, green infrastructure, which allows us, I hate that word, but allows us to kind of absorb water, and then a series of trails, recreational trails, and ecological bands. So this was before a lot of the construction. If you actually look at the site now, you'll see a number of buildings that are currently under construction. And what's actually interesting for us, because we believe architecture does have a social agenda, this is the largest development of middle-income housing in New York since 1970, 4,000 units of subsidized housing. So we hope that that will indeed remain, because it's an incredible and important event. But it's also a reminder that there is nothing natural about this site. It's been made and remade for well over 200 years, and you can start to see how complex the surface and the subsurface are. It actually enjoys one of the highest changes of topography on the East River, about 30 feet, and our hope is to capitalize that in the second phase with a kind of giant overlook that allows you to take in these magnificent views.
And I think, as Michael just pointed out in that last image, we can just say that we just issued our schematic set on this particular pier. It's a lot of complexity to make something look simple. But the complexity of simplicity was really at stake when we were looking at the kind of optics, looking at Manhattan on the broadest piece of land for the most dense part of the park's active uses. And so we actually questioned the assignment to do 4 separate structures: a maintenance building, bathrooms, a concession, and a shade pavilion. And we said, what of those actually could frame and shape and host this oval that could be temporal in its nature, whether it's a playing field or whether it was a place to actually capture the water. And so what you can see here is its ultimate resolution, and what looks like a crescent around an oval is a more complex debate than you can imagine. The Parks Department wanted 100% artificial turf to be durable to the schools playing nearby. The Department of Review for the Arts valued very much a 100% natural lawn. This debate played out. They drew a scheme for us with a rectangle of artificial grass in the remnant of the oval. We came up with a different idea. And really, the opportunity then to actually lift the land and create a place where you could actually be on the natural grass and observe the kinds of games that are occurring here became a real opportunity. So that the whole of the park here is one where the kind of wildness of the edge and the kind of bike lanes, car lanes, pedestrian lanes, and water collection line on the one side could actually be counterpointed by multiple worlds, not singular worlds. And so you could see in just one particular view the little dogs and large dog run, the rail garden and the playground, and the kind of wandering edge that you can see as a place to look out on the open prospect. And at the terminus of one of the streets is a kind of legacy of the industrial pass, capturing no longer just the transfer, but new growth. And what had been Water Taxi Beach is now really a beach that actually welcomes even smaller children with incredible views, and that hybrid structure, 4 and 1, is really a hard-working element there, because with its crimped roof, it's collecting solar power to actually power the entire park. It's collecting water to actually handle the landscape. And you can start to see it. It's really put together very much the way a boat is put together, and the cuts themselves allow uplift to be avoided. But most importantly, I think the thing that's interesting is that this truly is a destination by water and by land. And the water taxi comes right here, the ferry comes right here. And it really is truly probably the most amazing place to see Manhattan, not when you're in it, but when you're across from it. And it really is an extraordinary landscape that's always unfolding. So our sense is that when things come into focus, as opposed to being ubiquitous, we understand them in new and different ways. And coming into focus in new and different ways becomes an entirely different question when you're looking at a private campus of a pharmaceutical company, in this case Novartis, out in East Hanover, when they are really trying to take something that is private and still have an opportunity to welcome visitors. We were fortunate to be invited to do both their visitor center and their oncology headquarters, and so as well as some of the other guard booths at the perimeter. And so what was interesting here was to actually think about how do you welcome people on a campus that must be secure in its nature. It's surrounded at its perimeter continually by a fence. But what if the fence and the walls were to somehow become inhabitable at a moment to welcome you in and let you slip through that wall? And that was what inspired the idea of actually taking that wall and that plane, the airside, landside question that these secure points raise, and actually create a place that you could happen through with a celestial soffit that would be luminous at night, so that even when people drive by at night, they know that this is a place where they could visit and be welcomed. And you can see this kind of lifting from the parking lot. One of the things amazing about the parking lot is it's covered with a trellis of solar canopy, so that this is an energy neutral building as well. And as you come in here, you can see the columns that are completely in compression at the center and effectively in tension for uplift at the perimeter, framing a kind of view that when you come in here, that soffit, if you will, is illuminated by those central columns. And by day, natural light spilling in on both sides as it passes through the landscape. And the idea here is really that once you pass through and you're waiting to be picked up, you are in the landscape and somehow part of a new place, and a place where you're both inhabiting the landscape and once again the building itself wanders back and becomes the wall that it came from.
So the building itself, and we have some slides here that talk about it. It's just open, so it's quite fresh. But I think we were interested in the possibility that this project could challenge the conventions of work and play. And as many of you know, you go to Starbucks with your laptop and study just as easily as taking your latte or your cappuccino or a beer into a library. And those kinds of shifts are certainly part of how we work today and how we play today. So this was an opportunity to kind of think about the box, which was defined by a master plan by Vittorio Lampugnani. So every project, ours, Fuhimi, Komaki, Vignoli, and Chipperfield, which is to come, is a very simple rectangle. So if you can't punch out of the rectangle, quite obviously you tend to carve into it. And it was also an opportunity then for us to think programmatically about a series of communal living rooms that would provide a connection between the more prosaic open office work areas and places that become more public. And you see that kind of ascent in this very quick sketch. And you can start to see it calibrated in the section. The section is quite interesting because what you can start to see at the top are a series of beams. So everything above the promenade, above the woodline promenade, is actually hung. All the floors are hung. The floors below the promenade are supported conventionally. So as that wraps, the structural system behaves so that the cut here, the kind of marking on the facade of this kind of ascending set of living rooms, is completely column-free. And you can start to see how that plays out in some of our studies as we develop the kind of reciprocity between inside spaces and a skin. And as you can imagine, having seen some of the work so far, is we're interested in the kind of chameleon quality that projects can take on, the sense that they change with the passage of time over the course of the day. But here you can start to see in this relatively simple box the kind of heroics of providing column-free spaces and how that heroics then gets played out in a series of fairly sophisticated curtain wall panels. The panels are a combination of multiple glasses. There's fritted glass, highly reflective glass, and translucent glass. So even from the inside, the kind of translucent glass behaves and modifies light in interesting ways and modifies the environment, the very SYLVAN environment which this building's placed. And I should say this is a landscape by Michael van Valkenburg, so it's particularly beautiful. And you can start to see how that kind of section is inscribed in the surface of the building, kind of like in taglio, where it marches and moves up and then finally ascends in a much more public room at the top. These are areas for food, lounging, informal meetings, informal parties can occur. And here you can see the kind of juxtaposition of both the public areas and the more prosaic work areas. And they're interchangeable, of course. You can move laterally or vertically. But finally, you see that kind of section, that kind of inscription of the promenade marked on a facade where the kind of, depending on the quality of the day, the earth or the sky are projected into the surface.
So this kind of inscription of what it means to think about earth and sky in new ways really comes into focus at Roosevelt Island. And some of you may know that Cornell Tech is building a new campus, and today, actually, had it not been for the storm would have been the groundbreaking. So we'll be looking forward to it very soon. But as you know, this is kind of an amazing gamble to say that the Cornell Tech could actually create a place where on a campus that would grow over time, they could actually bring together the idea of innovation of technology, of entrepreneurial activities, and experimentation to happen right here, both near and apart from Manhattan. Now, when we were brought on, and to let you know, SOM, field operations, had been working on the master plan. Tom Main's doing the first academic building to the one upper part of the slide, and we're doing the corporate co-location building. Strange question, boxy site, blocking river-to-river views, and our question was, gosh, wouldn't it be amazing if you could actually take that box, break it through, and actually capture vistas across both Manhattan and Queens and to the bridge. And if we were to do that, and we were actually able to take that hourglass form in the center and pull it up topographically, we could actually diminish our risk by being so near the water and actually create a compression area that pulls the whole landscape in and through the building. And so then that question, how do you actually have collaboration occur in this strange word, co-location? 1/3 academic, 2/3 entrepreneurial startups. You get them to collaborate in the center and section. And what Cornell Tech was intrigued with was maybe the kind of slow directedness of academia needs to be given the counterpoint of the upstart entrepreneur, and maybe the Silicon Valley garage could somehow captured in this crystalline kind of petri dish that could actually land on the island, and then you could start to see what it means. And our interest here was to actually reduce our ground floor footprint, to expand the landscape, pull it inside. And there's Tom Main's building, Morphosis building, closer to Manhattan. And what you could see now is that structure, this kind of prismatic structure and hourglass, is starting to come together with an idea of reflective prisms to either side and a very transparent lens at the center, where actually everybody can come together both in section and in plan to actually collaborate and actually take total advantage of this extraordinary horizon beyond. So this question of collaboration, I think, gets right down to the wire here between Columbia and Barnard. And if you think about the Diana Center, in some ways, the fact that the undergraduate architecture program is hosted in this building is an extraordinary provocation for us. Barnard College is an amazing place, 4.5 acres in an amazing college behind these gates. And hidden behind that is this kind of very special landscape of an upper garden and a historic garden. But the strange thing is that all that was well hidden by their campus center. And if you look at when it was built in the 60s, of course, women needed to be protected from the city. And you could see that that little slot window was all they wanted to allow as a connection between Barnard and the rest of the city. And yet, when we were asked to do the project as part of a competition, the question that came through for us was, how do you actually take 100,000 square feet and actually allow the connection of a landscape also inspire connections through the section of the ground plane in the building? And how could we actually then take a very opaque world that's hidden and actually reveal something that's very extraordinary inside? And so you can start to see this question was one that even provoked us further inside. A historic landscape, a big wall and a set of steps, and an upper landscape thoroughly disconnected. And our question was what it would be like to actually taper our building so that you could see from the historic core all the way to the gateway through an ascending set of terraces, which, by the way, did displace the bowling alley below, and actually allow that wandering landscape to inscribe itself also on a facade that would allow you to walk vertically, crisscross on the campus, not horizontally or laterally like most campuses, but in fact up and through. And that up and through, the idea of these tiered spaces that would allow you to actually look down or up and have a sense of what's happening in the gallery critique space on the upper level while you're having a coffee below, or have a sense of that collapsed, simultaneous kind of stimulation of peripheral vision that gives you a sense of all the different programs captured in this building. And to be able to see a kind of magic carpet, if you will, when you're up at the top of the gallery critique space, having a pinup or a jury that's not going well, you could text your friend down in the cafe and get your coffee brought up to you afterwards. But really it's a sense that it's not just for the collective, but also for the individual, and that somehow a building like this needs to actually host both and make both things welcome.
So if the primary organizer is a sort of series of ascending public rooms, there are a series of also interesting and very specialized events that occur below grade, because probably 1/3 of the building is actually below grade. So you can see the black box, which is an incredibly precise instrument for hosting a whole range of theatrical performances. It's actually a box within a box. It's very close to the #1 subway line, so it had incredible acoustic challenges. Above that is the event space, which in a way kind of defies the orthogonal quality of most of the spaces. So it's a bit of a surprise. It's two slipped elliptoid spaces that allow you to accommodate up to 500 people, the larger ellipse, or more often, if you're seated in the narrower or the more finely scaled ellipse, there's a sense of being more finely scaled. So likewise, if all of these spaces are visually connected, they're actually connected through a sort of stair that is embedded into the west facade of the building. And it's like taking the campus walk and moving it up and turning it vertically. Our client joked that this was the least efficient stair that they could ever pay for. We took that to be a compliment. And from that stair, though, actually, which is the umbilical cord of the building, you're always looking out and in. At times, that becomes a place of performance. We never anticipated dance and choreography. I think our insurer would look at this and be absolutely apoplectic. But that stair actually slides and becomes sometimes a bay window. And of course, being architects, it ends in the architecture studio, so no apologies there. And the building, of course, is clad in about 1,000, I think 1,107 panels that all change depending on their orientation. And what we wanted to capture was the kind of accident of the grit that you see, the kind of texture on the paper that somehow could be transcribed through the use of frit. And this led to a very interesting experiment, because the first, I think, thoughts were that this would be a brick building, and it was clear that we wanted to move it, and the trustees wanted to move it in a different direction. So it picks up the kind of chroma that you find in this area. And after much testing, we settled on a kind of acid-etched, chromatically infused, a kind of terracotta-colored glass that also was fritted in some locations. So you can start to see the glass actually behaves, it's a bright red when the sun hits it, and becomes a little darker, more somber, a lot like Teachers College, depending on the orientation. And then finally, if this was the idea of education for women, it's hoped that this building would offer an alternative model. This is the second to the last project we'll show, the SINGH Center for Nanotechnology, and it too opened very, very recently. It's in a part of Penn's campus closest to the city, and we show this because Penn has this unbelievably interesting checkerboard of open spaces that in some ways are exemplified by the urban plan by Penn. So for us, it was very important not to just position a building, but to think of the building as making a kind of mini quad, a mini piece of Philadelphia. Here's the setting. It's actually a very, very dry setting. There isn't much hospitable there. Surrounded by a rather dreary lab and a rather fantastic garage by Romaldo Jurgala. But it was also a place where, because of the sensitive equipment, there was a kind of sweet spot for the labs. So the labs, in a way, found their kind of own sort of center of gravity, and around that center of gravity, there's a kind of a swirl of open public spaces that start to wrap, and through the sort of device of a cantilever, define an open space that's open to the public. So you can start to see the kind of operation of taking the lab boxes, moving them, shifting them, and trying to, within a very prescribed kind of typology, create something larger and more expansive. Expansive not only in plan, but also in section. So you can start to see the project just as it, probably on opening day, and you can start to see the kind of complex structural systems and spatial systems that start to allow us to negotiate a 68-foot cantilever, which is pretty extraordinary, but of equal challenge is a sort of lateral cantilever that allows us to displace columns in section. And that allows us to create an interior space where some columns are in tension, others are in compression. So these sort of senses of overlap, of compression and expansion can be played out.
And what's interesting when you think about the strange signature here of amber is that we had been provoked when we visited a whole series of nanotechnology facilities by all these underground spaces with little portal windows that were amber colored. And we learned they were underground because they couldn't get any light that actually wouldn't be filtered of its UV rays except through that amber light. And we said, what would happen if people could see this research, pull it upstairs, and have everything through an amber wall? And it turned out we could technically achieve that. And so that's what led to the creation of these amber-lit labs. These are the clean rooms, the kind of bay and chase space where you could actually see the kind of public realm and the private realm side by side. And that high technology, that kind of incredible sort of bay and chase structure is one where the kind of supports that go on with this occur not only in plan but in section. These spaces have roughly 3/4 mechanical space to keep them clean for every 1/4 research area that you can imagine. The one space that could get natural light space, which was in the characterization suite, was in the lower level, and we pulled the landscape down to bring natural light into that what would have been a basement level. But then this kind of curious question, if lab floors are 20 feet floor to floor, that's 2 stories in an apartment. And yet, because the elevators had to be very, very far from the research areas for the vibration and the EMI interference, we actually had to create staircases that did something altogether different. They actually had to host meeting spaces along the way so that people could be pulled out of their lab spaces and go floor by floor, but actually utilize the section and not just the ground plane for collaboration. So you can start to see this stair with a series of 8x10 landings that actually bring into focus the research spaces, the meeting spaces, and ultimately the one space that didn't have the same critical vibration and EMI sort of interference criteria was the forum. We took the most public space, pulled it up to the upper area, and it was one where being within and inhabiting the 68-foot cantilever could create a very intimate connection, both with learning and engagement, but also with the host of sort of looking over the whole campus and the city, elevating that area so that we could have the largest landscape possible in this place of engineering where there was no landscape at all. The labs didn't want light from both sides, only on one, and so we actually were really intrigued with the idea of the most opaque surface playing with light in unusual ways. And so this is a folded silver metal wall, and it's one where it actually unfurls to allow the more crystalline liner of the courtyard and those lab spaces to be seen in contrast. And yet the one thing that we also had to engineer in a very unique way was the idea of resilience and water collection. So this is our stormwater management system, both as a public landscape and also as a hard-working mechanical landscape. And you can start to see them all together. And we were so fortunate to have a brilliant client with Eduardo Glant who dug the Tony Smith out of hiding and brought it to the center of our quad. So you could see that we managed to have art and landscape research and public life all in one setting. And it really is this kind of collapsing of the all at once, and all at once in the city, all at once in the campus, and all at once illuminating research is what we got so excited about actually bringing to life. So this question of all at once actually in our final project here at the Olympic Sculpture Park was the most provocative all at once question you could imagine. What would happen if you were to actually look at creating a park where art could be free and open to the public on a waterfront site in downtown Seattle? Sounds great. In fact, that was even more amazing because that land never existed until 1929 when Denny, the developer, actually hosed down a bluff to create all this new land on the water. Not very environmentally correct, and anybody who wouldn't sell their land had to sell a little bit later. But the real question that was so interesting for us was that the museum had the audacity to say that they had one site when they didn't. They had three that were divided by an arterial highway and a train route. Not to mention that it was fully contaminated because it was an oil transfer facility as well. It had a failing seawall and a 40-foot grade change. And we said, wow, fabulous. They said if they had funds, they wanted to cover it all up. Millennium Park actually took that model and covered up the tracks to create a park. But we said, maybe they don't have enough money and something more interesting can happen. And if the forces of the infrastructure could actually still inscribe their way through the site, and yet somehow we could connect from the city to the water, that would be a remarkable sort of thing, because then we could leverage all that was unusual in one particular setting. And so the idea really was to build this kind of landform that was, again, something that would be most urban at the urban edge and most natural at the water's edge, and take this site and superimpose a park that might wander from the city to the water's edge. And it's an amazing thing because the all-at-once factor, you know, we found that we could get $2 million in federal funding if we create salmon habitat. Yes. We found out that we could actually host 67 cars and an incredible black tie room all at the same time if we had a free-span garage. And that we also found out that if all these systems could be layered one after another, we could also encapsulate the contaminated soil but still have a 2-mile backbone of water, electricity, and teledata so that anything could happen later. And all of this could be created as an earthwork that actually could be built as a landform that would wander across the highway and the train tracks and actually be built very inexpensively with typical highway construction here, MSC, which is mechanically stabilized earth. All the overpasses that you see in the highways are made this way. But we could deal with the seismic activity of Seattle by creating these precast walls having 42 inches above there to be a guardrail, overlapping so that if there's an earthquake, they could move around. And so you could see these things being installed. It's a very, very simple system, but it's one that could actually host art in ways that had never been seen before, except in the movie Rocky on the Philadelphia steps. This is Calder's Eagle. But also could take a hillside up towards the Space Needle and actually start to host a pavilion that could be, in many ways, a reduction of this unfolding kind of geometry that we shape the landscape with to also shape the building. And that unfolding idea could invite the cars below, the people above, and a kind of threshold that is a spectacle of both inside the kind of Kunsthal and culture happening in more ephemeral ways. In fact, hosting many, many changing landscapes. And then actually when you're driving along, these kind of ribbon windows that are directly parallel with the car when you're on the road give you a hint of what's going on. And again, these walls of both the building and the landscape and the landform are seen together to also shape things like the valley being a host for Richard Serra's work and an amphitheater, a very sort of hallowed place, but also maybe less hallowed on Saturday mornings. And it really is wonderful to think about. They're bowing to the art piece. Wonderful to think about this. This park hosting things that we never planned on. This is a recent photo. But then also the question of actually this simultaneous sense that both below and above the highway is a place where if you actually could set up a tripwire, everybody who drives across here counts as a visitor to the museum. And everybody who crosses at this point counts as somebody who literally crossed the dead center part of the highway. And this dead center is really the question of what it means to actually bring a point to the point.
There was a lot of debate about whether we should show this project early on or late. And actually, we've had the privilege of coming back recently to see the project and to make some changes some 5 years later, 6 years later. So these are very recent. Some of these slides are very, very recent. So this is, in a way, a recent project. We're reshaping some of the paths. The paths have taken on a tremendous amount of abuse. Lots of people, which is a good problem to have. And you can start to see that actually play out in some recent photos by Iwan Bond, where the grasses are starting to mature in interesting ways during the summer. It's almost a wheat color, and that's juxtaposed against grass that's lightly irrigated and almost emerald green. You can start to see the kind of crossing of the infrastructure where the kind of landform slides over the highway and makes its way over train tracks. This is taken early in, I think, 2001, where the train tracks were this kind of very much of a barrier. And we imagined that the train tracks, rather than being concealed, would, as Marion noted, be part of the kind of playful quality of the project, so that you could imagine these trains as giant kinetic sculptures. So this has, in fact, become one of the most popular parts of the park, including the setting for Teresita Fernandez's throw fence, Seattle Twilight. And it's a rather beautiful juxtaposition where the kind of quality of the art plays with the quality of the architecture and the landscape. We could spend 2 or 3 hours talking about the art, so I'll kind of zoom through it very quickly. Marion mentioned the Calder, which was the one piece that started the project. But this is an amazing image. These are part of Richard Serra's wake, trucked from his Long Island studio, so you can imagine the kind of choreography. And here he is, the kind of proud father, standing like Richard Serra would stand, in front of pieces that, in all seriousness, are unbelievably fluid and light, and the antithesis of what you would imagine Corten steel to be like. So here you see it, and it was very important in his work to have clear geometric edges so that his work would resonate and have boundaries. A different artist, Mark Dion, very different generationally, is housed in the greenhouse, which appropriately houses a 75-foot long nursing log, a very different kind of art, an art that is always about impermanence. It is about entropy. It's the antithesis of Richard Serra's work, and a beautiful companion to that. And then finally, there's the appropriation of the waterfront. And it had been a parking lot. You couldn't touch the water in Seattle, even though the water is all about Seattle's genesis, its being, its heart. So there's now an opportunity to ride a bike, to take a nap, to play with your kids, to enjoy Love and Loss by Roy McMakin, and to, in a way, reconfigure the waterfront for, and I'll talk about this in a minute, one of the most kind of intriguing and perhaps subtle aspects of this project. It's also a setting where this piece by Jaume Plenza was recently installed, so the sort of sense that art is always installed and reinstalled. It's amazing. It looks like Photoshop, doesn't it? That's scary. I think this is one of the parts of the project that we're most proud of. And here we could reclaim a beach. This beach is, there's nothing natural about this. This is unbelievably carefully engineered, both in plan to take in wave action, but more importantly to restore salmon habitat. This was a very important goal of the Seattle Art Museum, an amazing goal for an art museum, to restore salmon habitat. And this being Seattle, we worked with not only one salmon expert, but two. Public debates, of course, they didn't see eye to eye. They had different ideas about juvenile salmon. But what's amazing is now the Washington UW has been monitoring in a way, the reclamation of habitat. So this is an amazing photograph. This is a landscape that few people see. It's this kind of aqueous landscape, one of our favorites. This is what juvenile salmon like. It's a cool place to hang out, just like their human counterparts. And again, I think this image reminds us that there's nothing natural about this image. It's artifice, it's constructed. Nature does take over in unpredictable, surprising, and eventful ways. And this project is about a kind of natural or ecological infrastructure. It's a cultural infrastructure. And then finally, it's a social infrastructure. So we'll close with this very recent image. Here, the ideal and the circumstantial, the infrastructural and the temporal are collapsed to suggest a new form of public nature, one which expands the philosophical and physical terms of an architecture that can both critique and transform reality. Thank you. Yeah, and the one on the right is the advancer.
So there were so many things about that talk and about Weiss Manfredi's architecture that so many different directions you could go, so many pathways, so many interesting things from the way art and technology and landscape and opacity and transparency, all these things are always in play and interacting in unpredictable ways. There's one particular thing that has really struck me over the years about their work, and especially about the visitor center at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, is the way, I think partly because they're one of the very few firms that deal with landscape and built architecture from the very conception and execute it themselves. They don't really divide up those two disciplines. That negotiation between architecture and nature, and the way that is evolving, especially in an urban context, I find really thrilling. And it's made me think about precedent. In a way, the history of the modern city is about the stringent division between the built environment and nature. And the symbol to me of that is that when on a sidewalk in New York City, there is a tree planted in the sidewalk, we actually have a little fence around it to delineate the difference, in case anybody should be confused. Inside is nature and outside is city. And we do that kind of border creation a lot in cities. And if you look at historical pictures of, not just of New York City, but of many cities, one of the things that creeps up is that over the years, we actually have more trees and more greenery, and the trees that were planted a long time ago have matured, obviously. And New York and other cities, Rome is another one, have really gotten much greener over the years. And it's not just that the trees have grown, but that there are those kinds of borders that we sort of fight to create, and that modernism especially fought to create, have begun to be blurred. So it's really interesting to see architecture that does that overtly. So if you have kind of the idea of architecture of a building in a landscape or on a landscape, and then progress from that to architecture that is embedded in the landscape, like Falling Water and many of Frank Lloyd Wright's designs, and then beyond that to the landscape infiltrating the architecture, like at the Ford Foundation, where it's really bringing nature inside. What we have here is a kind of intertwining of landscape and nature, landscape and architecture, that I think is something that doesn't look as new or as radical as it really is, because it's done so subtly and so effectively and so pleasingly. And also because I think it resonates with something very deep in our association with landscape. Specifically, it becomes romantic. In a way, I'm not sure that Michael and Marion would ever use that word to describe their own architecture, but it strikes me that way. And I think it's romantic because there's two elements that they have created out of the dynamism. And the minute you have a green roof with tall grass and changing the seasonal adaptability of nature, you have architecture that changes. And that creates an element of magic, and it creates an element of danger, because the minute you have nature kind of infiltrating architecture, there's always the danger that it'll take over. And that's what makes it romantic. And so there's an element of fantasy about it, and I think if I don't know if
Are just in slides there?
There we go. This is sort of the end point of that, right? The idea that nature and architecture are kind of merged, and this is sort of, it's a fantastical, fictional realization of that, but it has its roots in the same kind of interaction of magic and romance that I think Weiss Manfredi's architecture does. And I think that relates very strongly to our sense of ruins, because that's where the danger comes in. When we think of ruins that have where nature has begun to overtake the architecture, it's because there's a history of abandonment. But of course, that creates this incredible sense of picturesqueness and a very strong emotional relationship to the ruin. And it's something that transcends infrastructure, it transcends program, it transcends time. So whether we're talking about Piranesi drawing Roman ruins, or a contemporary photograph of what happens in Cambodia, this is Angkor Thom, where nature takes over the ruins and really inhabits it in a very human way, almost before you can really control it. And this is a slide from an illustrated 19th century chronicle of John Lloyd Stephens, an American explorer who went with the illustrator Frederick Catherwaite, who was British in the 1840s, to the Yucatan in Mexico, and discovered and explored a lot of these Mayan ruins that they found in the jungle. And in the account that they give and in the drawings, you can sense the excitement both of clearing nature away from the ruins and discovering these incredibly intricate artworks and infrastructure inside, but also the excitement of never really being able to clear the nature away. And that interaction that they found, and that they, on the one hand, wanted to undo by separating nature and architecture, and on the other hand, wanting to preserve. So this is one of the Mayan ruins. I believe it's the same one as Catherwaite describes. This is a reconstruction of what the ruins at Uxmal in Yucatan might have looked like. And if you notice, when we think of trying to reconstruct what the original city would have been like, there's no nature at all, because we assume that in its heyday, it simply would have been pristine architecture. We actually have no evidence for that being true, but the quality of the nature having re-infiltrated into the built environment is seen as a romantic overlay onto a useful construction. But that in itself, I think that idea is a kind of modernist conception of what those cities would have been like, because there's no actual reason to believe that they would have cleared nature away so ruthlessly. This is a different ruin, but it's what a ruin at Calakmul in the south of Yucatan near Belize looks like, in which you can see the magic of those enormous pyramids emerging from the jungle, and that canopy that you see is completely filled with tree-dwelling monkeys. And that complete interaction of nature and these mysterious ruins, because so much of what's there is not understood, has this kind of incredible dramatic power. And I bring these in because, partly just because that relationship reminded me of that, but also because I wanted to ask them, not that you architects will admit to thinking about the future of their buildings as, or to think of their buildings as future ruins, but whether any of that kind of romantic and picturesque quality of the interactions of nature and architecture was something that that you guys were thinking about. Does it resonate with your thought process, even though clearly you were much more concerned with the living function rather than sort of the kind of distant aesthetic, the aesthetic interaction?
Actually, Justin, those are amazing images and amazing observations. And the question of romance and ruin being seen all within the same breath really suggests that everything we make is subject to time. Everything we make is subject to weathering. And somehow the impact of time and weathering are the very things that allow us to think of romance, because romance is that one moment where things are no longer fresh but somehow florid in ways that we can't imagine, and hence landscape being the very florid element that grows and changes and impacts the effect of the more constructed and architectural world to embed it into something that wants to be natural again is fantastic. I don't know, in a sense, if we've ever thought about that, and yet we're passionate about the Piranesi images that you show. We're passionate about these images that you show that show landscape and architecture so tightly woven together. But the word romance is a very interesting one.
Well, I mean, clearly you've thought about how these buildings evolve over time. Can you talk a little bit about, since you mentioned weathering, and since some of the materials you use, glass and steel, exist to resist weathering, you know, as opposed to, say, copper or masonry. Do you think about how how your buildings age over a long span of time?
Yeah, and I suppose, but we still love glass. What can I say? You know, sometimes you have to kind of, you know, you say one thing and do something else. But you know, Justin, the only thing that I would really take issue with is, again, this 19th century idea of nature. And I think the one thing that we have learned from just doing work, but also from landscape architects we admire, is there's nothing natural about what looks natural. And the reason we mentioned the green roof at BBG, which is quite beautiful, and there's nothing wrong with beauty, and certainly a garden like BBG is all about seduction, that roof would not have been possible if we had not been able to demonstrate how it would work. And people look at Olmsted and they kind of forget, because they are, I think, perhaps seduced by the sublime in the sense of the picturesque, but Olmsted's landscapes are really tough, and they deal with different systems in a really hard-headed way, which we find actually quite beautiful. So I just would caution all of us, I think, as designers, to be wary of what we think nature is. It is, when we make it, it is artifice.
Yeah, I think that what's interesting to me about ruin is, of course, it is the new reality. It's the promise of what happens, you know, life takes over when nature takes over. But I wanted to pick up also on the different kinds of nature and architecture. Justin, you mentioned modernism, and Sejima was here in September, and I think her title was CANOPY. And of course, she is also engaging nature, but it's there's absolutely no section. You know, it's really a kind of framing. It's a question of optics. It's much more Miesian, and it's really interesting to me how the section, you start really with landscape, and then this kind of rhythm starts to build up. And I really love the new taller buildings where you're finding a way to continue to create that rhythm, even as you go up. And I'm wondering how high can you go before the kind of that effect of the section and proximity to the ground. I mean, would you do a skyscraper, or is that?
You know, it's actually really interesting. For the longest time, we were really compelled to think just about the lateral terrain as the most robust of all, because it has the greatest continuity and connections to larger systems, whether they're urban or natural. And yet, more recently, as building opportunities come our way that are taller, we've been really intrigued with teasing through the opportunities to say that lateral terrain that we know is so expansive and so easy to make connection, could it be tricked to actually introduce cuts and wandering through to create more social intersections between the kind of slab sectional separations that have bifurcated any kind of connectivity in vertical buildings, with the exception of the elevator. And yet it means that we need to design in inefficiencies, studiously so, in building types that the taller you go, all the market forces tell you to become massively efficient. And so we're working on now a new building right now for MIT, which will be the tallest building we've ever done. And we are having incredibly active debates about the necessity of inefficiency to create collaboration in taller sections.
When Marion mentions tall, it's all of 17 stories. So
it's pretty tall.
It's really
we're not talking
tall
about
You're getting there.
buildings
You're
in
getting
Manhattan. This is this is child's play. So for us, it's like, ooh, what do we do? I think you're raising a really good point, Amale, and I'm not sure how the psychology of the city kind of plays out, where certain people find their kind of ground plane. And even in a city, well, certainly in a city like Tokyo with multiple ground planes, that's even more attenuated and interesting. And New York does have maybe 3 or 4 different ground planes that we associate. And I think there could be some fantastic research that might start to allow us to better understand that.
When you talk about building in inefficiencies, I was actually wondering to what extent the projects you've shown are kind of like precious objects, because you know, they also push against just construction conventions, right? I mean, as soon as you go 17 stories is tall enough that, you know, what builders want to do is just do something, then do it again a bunch of times. And anything you do that's creating that, you know, diagonal section through and all of that breakup really drives up the cost.
Well, you sound like one of our clients, Justin. One of the things that we've had to become very good at and very clever about is managing budgets. And all of the projects we've been sharing have worked with incredibly constrained budgets. And that's usually where there's one moment where we have an epiphany about how to do something more effectively for less. At the Olympic Sculpture Park, our budget was very, very tight. The first budget came in, we had all these poured-in-place concrete walls. The walls alone exceeded the entire budget for the project. That's when we started working with highway construction and actually brought those down to 1/3 of the cost. And similarly, when you look at the project for the nanotechnology building, we were very fortunate because the labs themselves were very hungry for investment, but those were very, very regular. So that we had the luxury of actually having a more relaxed, albeit slender footprint, but rich section to create the kind of topography of collaboration. And so those kinds of trade-offs, you know, you have to get very, very clever about where you can squeeze out the kind of surprise that will allow these things to occur.
Actually, it's really interesting to think about budget, because now that you mention it, it does seem like there is also an economy of means. I mean, it's sort of like 3 elements that kind of you repeat at different scale, and it creates the rhythm, and it sort of, and it adds up to a whole that kind of works really well together. I mean, there is a sort of intelligence in, you know, being very strategic about the elements and how they come together. I don't know if that's
yeah. I think, Amale, it's interesting. We've only done one house and it's never finished, and we have this fantasy of a client saying, "Here, you know, wander, speculate." Most of our work is
never going to
institutional.
happen.
I know. We always think it'll happen to somebody else. But our work is institutional, so we really have to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to manage not only expectations, but also budgets. And I think in some ways, and you'd never want to say this publicly, that actually helps in a way.
You'd never want to say that publicly.
Right. Well, I've said it publicly. We've all seen architecture that is perhaps too promiscuous with both its budget and its aspirations, and so you're left with a project that's too much, built by too much, and in some ways actually having to justify virtually everything you do that's exceptional forces a level of incredible editorial judgment. And I think that's what you're talking about. And in school, it's hard to make those kinds of evaluations, although you do in your own work, particularly in the context of time. But I think as we've built more, we realize how important that is. And it is something that we won't want to talk about publicly, but it's there.
Maybe we should open it up. Questions?
Now, I know Columbia students are not shy. Maybe.
Well, maybe while you're gathering your courage, I have one other thing I wanted to ask you about, which is, I know you love glass, and
red, actually.
Red, thank you.
And one of the things that really strikes me that's very distinctive about your projects is that you manage to use glass extensively without relinquishing a sense of texture. And I thought maybe you could talk about that, because that seems to me on an urban scale to be one of the really main challenges. There is so much glass in dense urban environments, and what you get is a kind of like uniformity of a sort of shiny quality that spreads over the whole city. And so your experiments with getting different levels of detail and opacity are, I think, important.
I think what's really interesting is that glass is such an ancient material and it's always moving. And what we love is the idea that glass is not just transparent and invisible, because it's not. But we like to actually experiment with its different kinds of presences. And that's where the externally acid-etched terracotta color infused glass across the street at Barnard was so important to us, because it actually had the tactile kind of presence that brick could have, but still had the transparency that we wanted to invoke, and that somehow seeing those two side by side as a gradient of opacity and transparency allowed us to do something with glass that we don't normally think about. And similarly at Novartis, being able to play with that which was reflective as well as the externally acid-etched but totally translucent glass could allow you to see through things in different kinds of ways. And again, the kind of metering of these things together creates something for us that's not as conventional as what you've talked about, the ubiquity of the urban glazed environment. And so we are really, really intrigued with being able to continue this experiment with this incredibly ancient material.
Thanks. You mentioned in a couple of different contexts sort of what seems like a very intense approach to studying the context and history and different forces of nature or artifice that are taking place in a project. You mentioned sort of things ranging from the psychology of the city to, of course, like a great deal of study of the climate. So I'm curious if you could comment on sort of the role research plays in your practice and sort of how you engage in it in the process and in the method of doing it.
Yeah. Well, I think all of us, talk about research, and it's one of those words that perhaps is like landscape, maybe too heavily used. I think there is a kind of discipline to architecture, and I think right now everybody's infatuated, including ourselves, with multidisciplinary work, but I think as Hal Foster said so eloquently, before you can have interdisciplinary thinking, you have to have disciplinary thinking. And I think that does lead to the issue of research, too. And I suppose Marion and I operate in the context of a studio, and we're somewhat intuitive, and we rely, I think, also on the intuitions of those around us. So in a way, we need to kind of try to be as expansive as possible with the research, and some of that comes with time and climate. You know you can do certain things. You also know you can do certain things with materials. But I think we also try to immerse ourselves in the multiple histories of a place like Hunter's Point or like Seattle, and in a way that I suppose might give us a certain amount of strength in the conviction that there is no real context. The context keeps defining and redefining itself. So it's maybe a source material that allows us to move forward. That is a kind of soft research. I think then there's the very hard research, the thermal qualities of glass, the kind of the research that can be measured and very quickly quantified, the thermal resistance of an envelope, what a green roof can do. And I think that exists in a kind of parallel universe that also at times intersects the softer research.
I think, we both teach studios too, and we begin with research, and that the beginning of research is really a parallel set of whether it's cultural, physical, artifact-based, time-based, geologically based, or the future of what a material might be. We actually like to be unbelievably promiscuous and intense through a whole set of different lenses of what we're looking for, because what we're constantly trying to find are some magical intersections that we wouldn't know if we'd so narrowed our research just to one thing, how to be sustainable or how to do something historical or how to do something contemporary. But by looking at it all together, the surprises come along, and that's what we really like to do, is to postpone conclusions as long as possible and stretch the research out as long as possible so something can occur that wouldn't occur if we'd done just single strands of research.
Yeah.
Michael, you talked about your projects are institutional, but the one that stood out as not institutional is Novartis, and I'm interested in whether that kind of work for that kind of client, obviously an enlightened client. I mean, the project they did in Switzerland is amazing. But still a client with a commercial imperative and a lot of people working in a job as opposed to an educational environment, whether it brought in a different kind of set of different dynamics.
Yeah. No, it didn't. And I mentioned institutional mostly as not because in terms of the work activity, I think Novartis is an extraordinarily complex corporation, but it has all of the sort of institutional layers that come with a major university. So instead of the president of the university, there's Danny Vasella, who runs Novartis and certainly has a vision, or had a vision, for how the architecture would play out. But between him and the actual making of the architecture and the construction, it was an incredibly layered, very complex process. Certainly without that kind of vision, it wouldn't happen. It's certainly true at Penn, without the vision of a strong dean and a strong president, we would not have been able to get the kind of quality of work that you see on Novartis. So, and at Penn. So Novartis and Penn, for example, though one is clearly institutional, the other is commercial, they both share a very stratified and very, very hierarchical structure.
It seems that the richness of sections and the transitions and complexity in your work is obviously spectacular, so thank you very much for the work you do and what you said and you showed. I wonder, how would you position this brand of complexity in the dilemma, so to speak, between two words, which could be articulating versus blurring? Mm-hmm. I mean, I say that because it seems that there is a very strong architectural and tectonic thinking behind, so to speak, the object that emerges. But still, this issue of the negotiation is also a question of language and rhetoric in a way.
Yeah. You know, I think that's actually, Sandra, that's a really interesting observation, because the clarity of something or the merging of something into larger things, such as the landscape in the city, are that funny little fine line that we're constantly straddling and wandering through. But it's clear to us that the kind of diagrammatic clarity that we seek in all of our projects allows us to wander that line in different ways in different parts of the project, but without some clarity of presence, the kind of blurring, if you will, would not make any sense whatsoever. And it's that kind of tension. And blurring, I'd say, is not so much the word I would think of, but maybe merging with different kinds of tensions between that which is natural and that which is articulate and formal in terms of a built work comes to mind. When you think about those who were looking at the megaforms and megastructures, those were largely ideas about objects and more objects. And yet landforms and land art of artists actually started to look at that merging line. And I think we've been inspired really by the tensions of both.
I mean, my reaction to that is that the clarity of intention is always so sharp that you can merge a lot of things. I mean, as a music guy, I think in terms of counterpoint. And to me, when you have all those strands of research and apparently disparate things, like how do you exhibit in its ideal way a work of sculpture, and how do you foster salmon farm, you know, those two things don't seem to have anything to do with each other on the surface, but each of them have their own kind of logic. And so being able to merge those things, I mean, what I think is really always present is that whatever those strands are, the sensitivity of the way those things get overlapped and interplay, so that as you're going through any of the projects, you can follow any one of those strands and it has its own internal logic, as in a, you know, Bach contrapuntal piece, or you can step back and kind of watch those strands intertwine, or pick any other combination of things and it works equally well.
It's really nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
We'll do one more.
One more, sure. is the fun part.
This fun part, okay.
I'm curious what the makeup of your firm is like in terms of professionals. Is it mostly architects, or do you have, biologists on staff, and how you guys kind of work?
Yeah, I don't think we can afford to have biologists on staff, but it sounds fantastic. They're cheap? I don't know. We'll do that research.
Not as cheap as architects.
I know. We try to hire consultants and good consultants, and so a project like Seattle probably had about a dozen different consulting teams, and in some cases it was 2 biologists, 2 salmon specialists. In other cases it was a large civil engineering firm. Our office is relatively small, and we've often wondered if we should grow, and we've decided that it's probably good given the size, and we can find other ways of approaching large projects. So we have about 30 people, and they range from interns to architects with a fair amount of experience. And, but they all, I think, share a much broader idea of what architecture is. Some have landscape backgrounds, some don't. And I think all of them share a sense that to make a project, for example, like Seattle, requires an incredible kind of level of choreography that exceeds the capacity for any single firm, even if it's a firm of 200, because as you know, firms of 200, you never get 200 people working on a project. It's the same 5, 10 people. And in some ways, I think we found there's a sort of sweet spot at about 30 for us and how we're organized, that allows us to take on some larger projects and allows us to deal with complex agencies and complex urban situations without losing some sense of how we want to move a project forward.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for a really, really wonderful and inspiring lecture. Thank you.
I gotta get those ruins. Let's get those slides.